She did not cry at the funeral. Not because she didn't want to, but because she had spent so many years learning how not to, that her body had simply forgotten the way. Margot stood at the back of the room in a black coat that cost more than her mother's first apartment, and she watched the people who had known her daughter file past the small white casket, and she held herself very still the way she had learned to hold herself in boardrooms when the men across the table waited for her to flinch. Chloe had been 7 years old, 7 years and 4 months, to be precise, though Margot had stopped being precise about things like that somewhere in the middle of the second week after, when precision began to feel like a punishment she was inflicting on herself. The grief counselors came and went. They had careful faces and careful voices, and they left pamphlets on the kitchen counter that Margot never read. Her assistant, a quiet young man named Felix, who had worked for her for 6 years, cleared the pamphlets away each morning without being asked. She noticed this and said nothing. She did not know how to thank him for it. The house in Rosedale was too large for one person. It had always been too large, even when there were two of them in it, even when Chloe had filled the upstairs hallway with her drawings and her books, and the small plastic horses she arranged in elaborate patterns on the windowsills. After the funeral, the drawings came down, not because Margot wanted them gone, but because she had walked past them one evening in November and found herself unable to move for 11 minutes. She had counted the seconds. Old habit. When you grew up poor, you learn to count things. She was 43 years old. She had built a software company from a rented room in Scarborough when she was 26, had taken it public at 31, had been on the cover of 3 national magazines by the time she was 38. She had done all of this alone, or nearly alone, because the world had not offered her much in the way of assistance, and she had learned early that waiting for it was its own kind of poverty. None of it helped. She had learned that too. What she had not learned, what she could not seem to locate, no matter how many mornings she sat at the long window in her office, watching the city come alive below her, was how to be in a house that still smelled faintly of her daughter's shampoo and not come apart entirely. She hired a cleaner in January, a company, impersonal, with a van and a logo, and workers who rotated through every 2 weeks and did not know the history of any room they entered. She told herself this was practical. She told herself a lot of in those months that she did not entirely believe. The woman who changed everything arrived on a Thursday in early March. Her name was Wren. She was not from the cleaning company. She was from an agency that Margot's assistant Felix had found, a domestic support agency that placed experienced household staff on short and long-term contracts, and Felix had made the arrangements quietly and efficiently, the way he made most arrangements, because Margot had said one afternoon, looking up a problem, that the house was becoming, and she didn't know what to do about it. Wren arrived at 8 in the morning carrying a canvas bag and a thermos, and wearing a gray canvas jacket that had seen considerable use. She was perhaps 30, perhaps 35, with close-cropped hair and an unhurried way of moving that Margot noticed immediately, because it was so unlike the way most people moved in her vicinity, which was quickly, and with a slight edge of anxiety. Margot was already at the door when Wren came up the front steps. She had been going to leave for the office at 7:45 and had been delayed by a call from her board chair, and so she was still there, coat on, briefcase in hand, watching this woman come up her front walk without any apparent concern for the impressiveness of the house or the woman standing in its doorway. "Messieurs Beaumont-Osey," Wren said. Not a question, she already knew. Yes. Margot looked at her. "The agency sent your information. They usually do." Wren smiled. It was a small smile, not performed. "I won't be in your way." Margot had not expected to have a response to this. She found to her mild surprise that she didn't. She gave Wren the entry code and left for the office and spent the next 4 hours thinking about a Q2 projection that required her full attention. And she managed this, more or less, until about noon, when she found herself wondering whether the woman had found the broken drawer in the kitchen that Margot had been meaning to have fixed since October. She did not call to check. She went back to the projection. When she came home at 7 that evening, the house was different, in a way she could not immediately identify. Not cleaner, exactly, though it was clean. Not rearranged, because nothing was in a different place. It took her several minutes, standing in the front hallway with her coat still on, to understand what it was. It was warmer, not in temperature, in quality, as though the rooms had been returned to themselves somehow, settled back into their own shapes, the way a person settles after a long exhale. She found a note on the kitchen counter in a clear, practical hand. The drawer runner in the bottom left cabinet was loose. I tightened it with what was in the tool drawer. Let me know if anything else needs attention. No signature. Wren had her contact details from the agency. Margot read the note twice and put it on the counter and went upstairs to change. She did not examine why she kept it. The following Thursday Wren came back, and the Thursday after that. Margot was almost never home when Wren was there. She knew this because she arranged it that way, though she would not have described it to herself in those terms. She told herself she was simply busy, which was also true. She told herself the house functioned better with someone in it who knew what they were doing, which was also true. She did not examine the rest of it. What she noticed, without intending to, was that Wren left small evidence of herself. Not intrusive evidence, a drawer that closed more smoothly. A plant in the kitchen window that had been struggling for months now, standing upright and visibly healthier, having been repotted into a slightly larger container that Wren had apparently sourced from somewhere in the back of the utility closet. A loose tile in the upstairs bathroom regrouted with a precision that made Margot think, when she saw it, of a person who took quiet satisfaction in small things done well. She found herself thinking about that more than was warranted. In April, she came home early. A meeting had ended unexpectedly, and the next one had been moved, and she was in the house by 3 in the afternoon, which was not a time she was usually there on Thursdays. She heard before she saw anything the sound of someone talking. She was very still in the hallway for a moment. Chloe's room was at the top of the stairs. Margot's had not opened that door since November. She had told the cleaning company not to enter it. She had told Felix. She had not needed to think about it since, because no one had. The door was open. Not wide, but open. Margot's was up the stairs before she had decided to be. Wren was kneeling on the floor beside the windowsill. The small plastic horses were still there, in the arrangement Chloe had left them in, and Wren had not touched them. Margot could see that immediately they were exactly where they had always been. Wren had a soft cloth and was cleaning the windowsill very carefully around each horse, lifting none of them, disturbing nothing, working with a slowness and deliberateness that made the whole thing look almost ceremonial. She was talking quietly as she worked, not to herself or not exactly. She was telling the horses, or the room, or perhaps neither, about a market she had visited in Kensington the previous weekend, about a stall there that sold Ukrainian pickles, about how she had bought a jar as a joke and then eaten the entire thing in 2 days because they were genuinely excellent. She had not heard Margot come up the stairs. Margot stood in the doorway and listened to this woman talk about pickles in her dead daughter's room. And something that had been very tightly held in her chest for 5 months shifted without warning, and she put one hand against the doorframe because she needed it. Wren looked up. She did not startle. She looked at Margot steadily for a moment, reading the situation with the same unhurried clarity she seemed to bring to everything, and then she said, simply, she had them sorted by color, more or less. The lighter ones near the window. It was not a question or an apology or an explanation. It was an observation, an acknowledgement that the horses had an order, and that the order mattered, and that Wren had noticed it and respected it. Margot said, she spent 2 weeks on that arrangement. She told me it was a migration pattern. Where were they migrating to? She hadn't decided yet. Wren nodded as though this was a reasonable answer, because it was. Kids usually have a plan, she said. They just keep revising it. She went back to cleaning the windowsill. Margot stood in the doorway for another moment and then went back downstairs. She sat at the kitchen table for a while without doing anything in particular. Outside the window, the light was doing something complicated with the bare trees in the back garden, and she watched it until Wren came downstairs and said she was finished for the day and asked if there was anything else that needed attention. No, Margot said. And then, before she had decided to, thank you. 4. Being careful in there. Wren looked at her. Of course, she said. Nothing more than that. She collected her canvas bag and her thermos and left. Margot sat at the table for a long time after. She started coming home earlier on Thursdays. She told herself this was not related to anything in particular. She told herself she had been overworking, that the board had been suggesting for months that she take on fewer direct responsibilities. That coming home at 4 instead of 7 was a reasonable adjustment to make for her own health. These things were all true. She relied on this. She and Wren did not have long conversations. What they had were short ones that had more in them than their length suggested. Wren had a way of listening that was not waiting. She actually listened, with her whole attention, in a way that Margot, who spent most of her professional life in rooms full of people who were listening only for their opening, found unexpectedly disorienting. She asked Wren once, coming through the kitchen while Wren was examining the underside of a cabinet with a flashlight, what she had done before this. Social work, Wren said, without coming out from under the cabinet. 7 years. Before that, early childhood education. Why did you leave? A pause. I didn't leave, exactly. I needed something where I was working with one situation at a time instead of 40. This is. She came out from under the cabinet, brushing dust from her sleeve, one at a time. Margot thought about this for the rest of the evening. She thought about the 7 years of social work, about a person who had spent 7 years trying to hold up the weight of 40 situations simultaneously, and had then chosen, deliberately, to put that weight down and pick up something smaller, more intimate, more possible to do well. She thought about what that kind of decision required of a person, what it revealed about what they valued. She did not say any of this to Wren, but she stopped manufacturing reasons to leave before Wren was finished. In May, on a Thursday that had rained all morning and then turned suddenly and improbably beautiful in the afternoon, Margot came home to find Wren sitting on the back steps with her thermos and her face tipped up toward the light. She looked in that moment like a person who had found something most people spend their whole lives looking for without quite knowing what it is. Margot made tea. She brought 2 cups out. She sat on the step beside Wren, and they looked at the garden together, which was full of the things Chloe had planted 2 springs ago. The lavender that had survived, the roses that had not, the stubborn clump of mint that was already threatening to take over the corner bed. And they did not say anything for a while. And this was fine. This was, in fact, one of the better moments Margot had experienced since November. She planted most of this, Margot said eventually. I know, Wren said. I've been trying to figure out her logic. The placement is unusual, but it's working. She said gardens should be surprising. Margot looked at the mint. I told her surprising and chaotic were not the same thing. What did she say? She said I was thinking about it like a business person and not like a garden. Wren laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it landed in the warm afternoon air and dispersed. And Margot felt something she had not felt in many months. Not happiness, not yet, but the shape of it, the outline, the suggestion that it was still possible. She was right, Wren said. I know, said Margot. I knew it then too. I just didn't say so. The thing she had not told anyone, had told no one, not the grief counselors or Felix, or her oldest friend Denise, who had flown in from Vancouver and sat with her for a week and asked careful questions. Was what she had been doing at the school the day Chloe was hurt. She had been in a meeting she had chosen over the spring concert, the one Chloe had been rehearsing for since February, the one in which Chloe had a speaking part, and had practiced her 4 lines in front of the bathroom mirror so many times that Margot had them memorized from the other side of the door. The sparrow builds her nest from what she finds. She doesn't wait for those lines herself. Chloe had written those lines herself. The teacher had told Margot this afterward, at the school, in one of those conversations that Margot now could only remember in fragments. She had been proud, the teacher said. So proud of those lines. Margot had not been there to hear them. She had been in a boardroom on King Street, making a decision about an acquisition that could have waited 2 hours. She had thought it couldn't. She had been wrong. The accident happened on the way home from school. A driver who ran a light, a crossing guard who saw it and couldn't stop it. Chloe, who had not been afraid of anything in her short and particular life and who had died, the hospital told Margot, without apparent pain. This was what they said. Margot had no way to know if it was true. She had chosen to believe it because the alternative was not survivable. She had not told this story to anyone. It sat in her like a stone, and she carried it. And the stone did not get lighter with time the way people said stones did. It remained exactly what it was. She told Wren on a Thursday in June, without planning to, in the kitchen, while Wren was replacing a washer in the tap that had been dripping for months. She told her the whole thing, standing at the counter, speaking in the careful level voice she had developed for situations that required her not to break. She told her about the meeting and the concert, and the 4 lines, and the crossing guard and the light, that hadn't been run yet when she got into the taxi, and was run by the time she arrived at the school. Wren finished with the tap. She turned it on and off, checking. Then she turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at Margot. "You were supposed to be in 2 places at once," she said. "I chose the wrong one. You didn't know it was a choice. I knew there was a concert." Wren was quiet for a moment. She was not minimizing. She was not rushing toward comfort. Margot understood, watching her, that Wren had spent 7 years learning the difference between those things. "My brother was hit by a car when I was 19, Wren said. "He was fine, eventually, but for 3 months I wasn't sure he would be. And I hadn't been speaking to him. We'd had a fight about something I can't even fully remember now. What I remember is thinking that if he died, the last thing I'd done was decide he wasn't worth my time that week." She looked out the window. "He didn't die, but I thought about it for a long time. About what it meant that I'd made that decision that week, not knowing it was the last week I'd have to make it differently." Margot stood very still. "We always think there's another Thursday," Wren said. "Until there isn't. It was not absolution." Wren had not offered it as absolution, and Margot did not receive it that way. But it was something. It was a hand reaching into the dark, without flinching from what it found there. It was a person sitting with her in the stone, not trying to move it, just acknowledging its weight. Margot cried in her kitchen for the first time since the funeral. She stood at the counter and she cried, and Wren did not touch her or say anything soothing. She simply stayed. She was there and present and unhurried, and that was enough. That was, in fact, more than anyone else had managed. When it was over, Wren refilled the kettle. She made tea. She set a cup in front of Margot without comment, and they drank it. And outside the window the garden was very green, and the mint was still trying to conquer its corner, and the lavender Chloe had planted was just beginning to bloom. In July, Felix told her there was a profile piece. A journalist from a national publication had been working on a feature about women in technology and had cited Margot as one of its central subjects, and the piece was coming out in September, and someone had mentioned Wren to the journalist, and the journalist had called the agency to confirm. Margot found out on a Wednesday. She drove herself to the house, which she rarely did, and parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes thinking about what she was feeling. What she was feeling was protective, not in an abstract way. Wren arrived Thursday as usual, exactly on time, with her bag and her thermos. Margot was at the door. "I need to tell you something," Margot said. She told her about the profile, about the journalist, about the fact that someone had apparently mentioned Wren's name and Wren's employer, and the house where she worked, which was Margot's house, which had now become a fact of public record attached to a grief narrative that Wren had never consented to be part of. Wren listened without any change in her expression. "I'm sorry," Margot said. "I didn't know. I'll contact them and ask them to remove any reference to you or your work here. I should have. She stopped. I should have been more careful. Ren looked at her for a moment. You didn't put my name in a magazine? Someone did, because of proximity to me. Which is my responsibility? Is it? Margot found herself without an easy answer. She stood in her own doorway, in the house she had bought at 35, with money she had spent her 30s building, and she thought about responsibility, about what it meant, and where its edges were, and she thought about a woman who had left social work, not because she stopped caring, but because she needed to be able to do one thing properly. And she thought about 7 years of doing 40 things at once, and what it cost. I think it might be, Margot said finally. Or I want it to be. I want to be responsible for the things that happen in your proximity to me. Ren was quiet. That came out more formally than I intended, Margot said. The corner of Ren's mouth moved. A little. What I mean is, Margot looked at the garden, which she could see through the open door, the lavender very fully in bloom now, Chloe's chaos theory in full and undeniable flower. I don't want you to be a footnote in someone's profile of me. You're not a detail of my grief story. You're. She stopped again. Something was happening in her chest that she did not know the exact name for, but recognized from earlier this year, from a Thursday in June, from the shape of things beginning to become possible again. I don't have a tidy way to finish that sentence, she said. I'm better with financial projections. Ren set her bag down on the front step. She looked at Margot with the full, unhurried attention that Margot had been thinking about since March. You could try, Ren said, the untidy version. I would like, Margot said carefully, to know you outside of Thursdays, if you were open to that. Ren was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly, considering the way she considered everything, fully and without performance. I'm open to that, she said. It was not simple. Margot had not expected it to be. She had not done uncomplicated things since she was young, and even then, growing up in a 2-room apartment in northeast Toronto, with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a neighborhood that had its own ideas about what was possible for a girl like her, simple had never quite been the word. She called her old friend Denise, who flew in again, this time without the careful questions, and sat at the kitchen table and listened to the whole thing, and when Margot was finished, Denise said, "She sounds like a person who knows where she is in a room. What does that mean?" It means she's not performing. Most people are performing all the time. You know this. You spent years being very, very good at knowing the difference. Denise looked at her over her cup. You can afford to trust your own judgment here. Margot thought about this for a long time. She thought about what it meant to trust your own judgment when your judgment had also once told you that a meeting was more important than a spring concert. She thought about error and learning, and the very specific difficulty of distinguishing between caution that was wisdom and caution that was fear dressed up in wisdom's clothes. She took Ren to dinner, not to the kind of restaurant Margot usually went to. She had learned, from years of watching people brought into rooms they weren't comfortable in, how that worked, how it tilted everything, but to a Jamaican place in Scarborough not far from the rented room where she'd started her company. A small restaurant, family-run, where the cook came out to argue gently with customers about the proper level of heat. Ren ordered the curry goat without hesitating and argued back when the cook underestimated her, and won and ate with the unself-conscious pleasure of a person who had not been taught to perform restraint at dinner tables. Margot watched her and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not the familiar weight. Something with more air in it. They talked about Scarborough, about the parts of the city that the rest of Toronto had opinions about and Margot had grown up in. They talked about Ren's grandmother in Barbados, who had sent her, once, a package of pepper sauce that had taken 2 months to arrive and had been confiscated at customs. They talked about grief, but lightly, from the outside, the way you can talkie loosened its grip. Once it has slightly loosened its... Can I ask you something? Margot said, near the end of the meal. Sure. Why did you open the door? In March. Chloe's room. You didn't have to. Ren was quiet for a moment, turning her glass in her hands. It had been closed a long time. The air in there was. She paused, finding it. It felt like something that needed tending, the same way the plant in the kitchen needed tending. Not changed. Just. Attended to. You talk to the horses. I was nervous. I talk when I'm nervous. About Ukrainian pickles. They're very good pickles. She looked at Margot, something genuine in it. I wasn't sure if I'd overstepped. I thought about it the whole drive home. You hadn't, Margot said. It was the first time I felt like someone had been careful with her. Everyone else was careful with me. No one knew how to be careful with the room. Wren nodded. She understood the distinction. They walked afterward, through streets that Margot knew by a different version of herself, past the plaza where she had bought school supplies, and the park where the asphalt had never been properly maintained, and the street where her mother had lived until 6 years ago, when Margot had finally convinced her to let her help. You came a long way, Wren said, looking at the neighborhood. From here, yes? Do you miss it? Margot considered this honestly. I miss the feeling of knowing exactly what was needed. When you don't have anything, it's very clear what you need. The problem is more specific. It's easier to solve a specific problem. She looked at the street. Now the problems are larger and less clear and less yours sometimes. Margot looked at her. Yes, exactly that. The profile ran in September. Margot had worked with the journalist to remove the references to Wren. The piece was about her company, her history, and carefully, in 3 paragraphs near the end, about the year she had had and what she had found on the other side of it. She had approved this. She had decided, with some difficulty, that not speaking about Chloe at all was a kind of refusal that she did not want to make. The morning the piece came out, Felix left a coffee on her desk and said nothing. She appreciated this. She read it once, then put it away. She did not read the comments. She called Wren. It's out, she said. I know. I saw. A pause. The 3 paragraphs, Margot said, at the end. They were true, Wren said. I was going to say accurate. Okay, but true works too. She could hear Wren smiling. It was strange how much information you could carry in a pause when you had learned someone's silences. I'm glad you said something, Wren said. About her. I almost didn't. I know. I think she would have liked the bit about the garden. Margot leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her office, and outside the window, the city was fully in its September self, that particular September quality that Toronto had, the end of the heat, the beginning of something more serious, the light going gold, and specific in the way it only did for a few weeks before it closed down into winter. She would have said I described the mint wrong, Margot said. She would have said I made it sound invasive when actually it was just enthusiastic. Wren laughed. She had a thing about word choice, Margot said. Even at 7, especially at 7. Where did she get that from? Not from me. I'm much better with numbers. You wrote 3 paragraphs about a garden. Margot was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I had help. The garden was still out there, at the house in Rosedale, and the lavender was going to seed now, and the mint was enthusiastic, and in the spring there would be decisions to make about what to plant and where to put it. And Margot had already begun to think about this, not as a project with a projected outcome, but as something slower and less calculated, something that was growing in her peripheral vision, in the same way that most good things eventually had to, if you let them. She did not know what came next. She had spent a long time being very certain about what came next, certain enough to fill boardrooms and close deals and build something from nothing. And she had also spent the last year learning that certainty was a different thing than being safe. You could be certain and still be wrong. You could plan precisely and still find yourself in a doorway with your hand against the frame, undone by a woman talking to a windowsill full of horses. What she knew was this. The house felt like a house again. She had begun to cook in the kitchen on Sunday evenings, not the careful meal prep of a person maintaining health metrics, but actual cooking, the kind that made a mess and took longer than necessary. She had been to Scarborough twice for dinner and once to a market in Kensington, where she had, on Wren's recommendation, purchased a jar of Ukrainian pickles and found them, To her genuine surprise, excellent. She had begun to open Chloe's door on her own, just to be in the room, just to sit in the chair by the window where the horses were still arranged in their migration pattern. Still heading somewhere. Chloe had not decided yet, and let the room be what it was, which was full of her daughter, in the way that only rooms that have been genuinely lived in ever are. Not haunted. Inhabited. The way a good garden is inhabited, not by ghosts, but by everything that was planted in it, and grew. There was a particular afternoon in October when Margot came home to find Wren in the back garden turning the soil in the bed where the roses had not survived. Wren was not working that day. She had stopped by with a book she'd thought Margot might like and had ended up in the garden because the bed had been on her mind. "You don't have to do that," Margot said from the steps. "I know," said Wren. She kept turning the soil. "The drainage is wrong. If you want roses in the spring, the drainage has to be fixed before the ground freezes." Margot came down the steps and stood beside the bed and looked at the dark-turned earth, at the place where something had not survived and might, with the right conditions, try again. "What would you plant?" she asked. Wren thought about it, not quickly, not to fill the space. She actually thought about it, the way she thought about things. "Something stubborn," she said. "That's what this spot needs. Something that doesn't need things to be perfect to bloom." The afternoon was October golden around them, and the mint in the corner was still going, improbably, still green, and the lavender had gone to seed and would come back, and the bed was open, and full of possibility in the way that freshly turned earth always is, which is to say, without any promises, without any certainty about what comes next, but ready. That was enough. That was, Margot had learned, what ready looked like. She went inside to make tea. She brought 2 cups out. She sat on the steps and Wren sat beside her, and they looked at the garden together in the October light, and the city went on around them the way cities do, and the afternoon held them, patient and various and alive.